Ed, I was trying to figure out today how long we've known each other and worked together. And I got up to about 40 years, and then I, I stopped there.
Well, I think so because it goes back to the old discussion group that we used to have,
Sure.
and also the monthly dinners in New York,
Right.
And so it has to be 40 years.
And our offices were never that too far apart. You were in New York at that
Yeah.
palatial building on, what was it, Madison?
Well, I spent most of my years in that semi-palatial building at 195 Broadway,
Broadway,
which
yeah.
was a
With that grand Ma Bell AT&T. Ed, I'm going to take you back to one of the most important business stories of the century, the previous century, the breakup of AT&T, which you had a absolutely critical and important part. Because a lot of the viewers will be of a different generation, I want to give them a feel of what happened, when it happened, and let them take the story from there so they can appreciate the role you played.
Well, I think that there are some real lessons in that are contemporary. I mean, the story itself is an old story. It's ancient history, but by today's standards. As a matter of fact, it was, believe it or not, it was a quarter of a century ago.
Was it really?
Yeah. So
give us a year. That would have been what, 60?
82.
80. I'm sorry, 82.
Yeah, 82. Yeah. So, but I think it can be mined for some questions. Lessons. If you want me to talk about that.
Well, I'd like to. I want to put it in perspective.
But you want some context.
AT&T at the time,
Yeah.
I believe, was the largest company in the world.
That's correct.
Correct?
Yes.
And at the time, I believe you had about 1 million employees.
Yeah, I can still rattle those stats off for you.
Well, put that in context.
Sure, 1 million employees.
Right.
90 million customer accounts.
90 million.
90 million. 3 million share owner accounts. 500,000 pensioners. If you look down the list as well, it was a story. The breakup of the old Bell telephone system was a story that impacted every consumer in the United States virtually, and some abroad, because of our partnerships with typically government-owned telephone systems in Europe and Asia. So we were. So in the scale of the constituencies affected by it, there's probably been very few stories, Pearl Harbor maybe, or like that at all. Because of the many people who were affected by it.
Right. Now, the Bell system had a monopoly.
Yes.
And it got into the courts, and they ruled against Ma Bell and said, you must break up. Is that?
Well, it was what's called a consent decree. That is, the two sides, the Justice Department of the United States and AT&T, agreed to a settlement, which was then taken before the court, and following some other hearings, it was approved. So it wasn't the court's decision as such, but it would have been if it had gone all the way through. And so it was that's another thing about it. Even though it was a big antitrust case, it must have been maybe 6 years old by then, and but it was totally unanticipated that it was going to end that way, end before the judge rendered a decision, and end before it had run its course. So as a consequence, it was page one news.
All over the world.
Big time, for sure. And I could, tell you a little bit about that if you want, because...
well, again, to put it in perspective, you worked for Charles Brown,
right.
the chairman and CEO of AT&T.
Right, yeah.
And I believe, in addition to being in charge of communications for the entire corporation, you also were assistant to the chairman,
Yes,
were you?
yes, at that
So
time,
that brought about a very close working and personal relationship.
Yes.
Where were you and where was Charles Brown when that decision was handed down?
Well, the story goes like this, that it was not a surprise to me or to any of my colleagues in senior management, because what you do try to settle a case if you can. And so we had, so I knew that was being worked on. As a matter of fact, this was in the Reagan administration. We actually had achieved a handshake with the Carter administration, but when President Carter lost the election to Ronald Reagan, his guys said,
Forget it.
no last minute deals are going to go into the history book with our fingerprints on them.
Right.
So in any case, so it was not. I had actually done a plan for that earlier agreement with the Carter administration. So this was not a big surprise to me. But anyway, here's how the story unfolded. I was sitting at my desk in 195 Broadway, not the Palace on Madison Avenue, and Charles Brown called me on the intercom, as he frequently did, and said, "Can you come into my office?" It was right around the corner from his office. And so as I stepped out of my door, I ran into our Vice President and General Counsel, a man by the name of Howard Trenans, and it was evident we were both going to the same location. So we went into Charles Brown's office, and he said that, now by the way, this General Counsel obviously led the AT&T negotiations on the settlement, so it sure wasn't any surprise to him. But in any event, we go into Charles Brown's office, and he said, I'm ready to recommend to the board of directors that we make a settlement with the Justice Department, that this thing can go on for another 10 years. That's a lot of lawyer fees. And worse, in an antitrust case, when the government's trying to break up, we were no longer a 100% monopoly at that time, but we dominated the industry. You don't know what business you're in, or maybe in, 5 years down the road. And so, Charlie was aware of those kinds of considerations. We were running an annual construction budget of $25 billion. Wow. And how do you know what to invest in? Exactly. How do you know what to tell the Bell Laboratories to invent? I mean, So anyway, Charlie said, I'm prepared to recommend to the board that we accept. And then, interestingly enough, he turned to Howard and he said, where do I go? How do I lay down my sword? And Howard said, well, it's not as simple as you think it is, but it can be done. And then he explained, not to get into too much detail, but we were operating under a consent decree signed in 1954. So you had to go back to that court, ask them to vacate that decree, and then take the new decree to the new court and get it approved. So you've got two different judges, and those guys have egos, as it turned out. And anyway, then Charlie turns to me and he said, you have to demonstrate to me, or you have to show me that we can plausibly explain this. Meaning, with all those share owners and all those employees and all those customers affected, you know, you can't just send them a postcard. So is there, you know, can we explain this plausibly? Because we've been fighting that case, you know, quote, as they say, vigorously, you know, and it had been running for some years. So anyway, that's what he said to me. So he said, Ed, get to your typewriter. In those days, we were still using two typewriters. That dates it for sure. So anyway, that's how the news came to me. I went, we talked a little bit longer, and believe it or not, I went to, you'll recall that we had an apartment in Manhattan on 52nd Street, so I went home. And in the laundry room, I had a little desk and an old Olympia typewriter and a lot of coffee. And so I did it took me about 2 days, I guess. I did the whole plan in how we were going to announce it, how it was to be arranged, how it was to be done, all of the details, and then came back to Charles Brown's office a couple of days later. I worked pretty much night and day because, you know, the biggest fear is a leak.
Sure.
And so anyway, I bring it back to him and I take him through it, and he said, "Okay to me. What's next?" You know, so that's how it unfolded. But if I may, unless you want me to stop talking about this, there are a couple of other.
No, I want you to carry on. But it's curious that one of the most dramatic and important business stories and press releases of all time was written in the laundry room.
On an old German typewriter.
On an old German typewriter. Oh, that's wonderful. Go ahead, tell me
Well,
some
I didn't
of the
have
lessons.
any distractions while I was working on it. Well, what I was going to say, some of the lessons that would be true today, even though that case is history, and the irony, the whole Bell system is put back together again.
Isn't that irony?
In the form of two companies, the new AT&T and Verizon. So, but anyway, one thing I said to Howard in that first meeting, I said, we have to have a joint press conference with the Justice Department. It's very important, and that has to be a condition of this agreement. And what was in my mind, as you would know, and Howard got it, and Charles Brown got it immediately. An announcement like that was going to set off a media frenzy. And so what you want to do is get both sides together at the same time, the same place, and tell the story.
Right. So
that you don't have reporters, you know, we announce it, and then the reporter calls the Justice Department and says AT&T is saying so and so. What do you say to that? And you know that goes on forever. And if you're to get a coherent story out of a zillion reporters, you know, doing that is, you know, you're going to have chaos. So I did say joint press conference. Well, as it turned out, the Assistant Attorney General for Antitrust was okay with him. He was by the way, he was a college professor, or had been at Stanford. And so we did have a joint press conference, and that really helped the reporters get the story straight. But it made it possible to tell the story one time, one way, one place, and stick to it. Right. And that's what we did on a Friday afternoon in Washington at the Overseas Press Club. There were about, as I recall, about 110 reporters attended the press conference. And that weekend, as I recall, going from memory, that just in the AT&T PR department, not in the Bell companies, but we fielded 4,000 queries.